My name is Lily, and I'm 58 years old, but nothing prepared me for the day my parents showed up at my doorstep, unannounced, demanding $12,000 for a roof I built with my own hands when I was 16. Before I could even ask why, my mother leaned in and whispered, "Pay us, or you're dead to this family." I thought that was the worst of it, until a neighbor pulled me aside hours later and said, "Lily, your parents told everyone you refused to help your dying parents." They weren't dying. They weren't even sick. That's when something in me snapped. Because that lie, small on the surface, was the first thread in a web I didn't know existed. And when I started pulling it, everything unraveled. The stories they'd told, the money they'd hidden, and the truth they spent decades burying. By the time I uncovered what they were really using the $12,000 for, it wasn't just shocking. It rewrote my entire childhood. And sometimes I feel like I've spent every one of those years trying to convince myself that my parents love me in the way parents are supposed to love their child. The truth, as I've slowly learned, is that love was always conditional with them. Conditional on obedience, on sacrifice, on silence. According to them, everything good in my life was because they gave me life, and therefore I supposedly owed them everything in return. That phrase, "you owe us everything," was practically the soundtrack of my childhood. I learned early that affection had a price. It came in brief spurts, little crumbs, always followed by a demand, a reminder, or a guilt trip so skillful that even now I sometimes catch myself falling for the familiar rhythm. When I was a teenager, I used to imagine that once I saved enough to leave, everything would finally make sense, and I'd have the freedom everyone else my age seemed to take for granted. I worked whatever part-time jobs I could find, babysitting, bussing tables at a diner, shelving books at the library. Every small paycheck felt like another step toward my independence. But my parents had other plans. They told me they were struggling, that they just needed a little help, and they managed to corner me with that emotional script they always used. They painted themselves as helpless, suffering, and so deeply betrayed by the idea that I wouldn't immediately hand over the money I had earned. I still remember the tightness in my throat as my father said I was being ungrateful for even hesitating. In the end, I caved. I gave them all the money I had spent years saving for college, every last dollar, because I couldn't stand the idea of being the selfish daughter they made me out to be. A week later, they bought a new television and threw a backyard party, and when I asked, carefully, quietly, what happened to the money they said they desperately needed, they laughed. My mother swatted her hand in the air and said, "You should be proud you could help your family. Stop worrying about where money goes. It's rude." Then she added the line I would hear over and over. "Don't forget, you owe us everything." Shortly after that, the roof on our house started leaking. It was a small drip at first, but my parents reacted as though the entire structure was collapsing. They blamed me for stressing them out, for making everything harder, for forcing them into a financial corner, though they were the ones who had misused my savings. And then, in the most surreal twist, they informed me that I would be the one fixing the roof. They said it would build character. They said it was the least I could do. They said, again, that I owed them. So there I was, a teenager armed with a borrowed hammer and a stack of shingles, climbing onto a dangerously steep roof, while my parents sat in lawn chairs below, drinking lemonade and telling neighbors how responsible I was. I spent days under the sun, blistered, exhausted, covered in cuts and bruises, but they barely lifted a finger. They told everyone I rebuilt the roof out of love. But the truth is, I did it because I didn't have a choice. I didn't have a choice then, but I'm not that teenage girl anymore. Still, the past has a way of circling back. A week ago, my parents called me completely out of the blue. They said the roof was leaking again. I felt a tremor of old anxiety, the kind that sits behind your ribs, but I listened. They reminded me that I built the roof decades ago, implying the damage was my fault. They insisted it was now my responsibility to fix it. Then, they delivered the real blow. They wanted $12,000. Not an estimate, not a request, a demand. They said the number with the kind of certainty that comes from rehearsing it. They insisted they needed it immediately, And when I asked why the repairs cost so much, they snapped. They accused me of interrogating them, of distrusting them, of forgetting what I owed. And for the first time in a long time, I pushed back. I said I needed proof, an invoice, a contractor's visit, anything. They went silent for a moment, and then my mother, with the coldest voice I've heard from her in years, said, "Lily, if you don't give us the money, consider yourself cut out of the family." That was their ultimatum. And in that moment, something inside me began to shift. Their threat was only the beginning of what they had planned. Lily is blindsided when her parents show up at her home without warning. I was washing dishes when I saw their car pull into my driveway. No call, no warning, no courtesy. Just the familiar dented silver sedan and the two people who had spent a lifetime teaching me to brace for impact whenever they appeared unannounced. My chest tightened. 40 years of conditioning does that to a person. They climbed out of the car, already wearing the faces they reserved for manipulation. Strained concern mixed with theatrical disappointment. My mother didn't even wait for me to open the door before she said, "We need to talk, Lily. Now." My father hovered behind her like a shadow, arms crossed, jaw tight. I stepped aside to let them in, though every instinct screamed not to. The moment they crossed the threshold, the tension thickened. They didn't sit. They didn't ask. They simply launched into it. "The roof is worse than we told you," my father said. "We could lose the house. It's an emergency, and you're morally obligated to help." There it was, that word. Obligated. It was always their favorite. I took a slow breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I already asked for repair estimates. Why won't you show me anything?" My mother clutched her chest dramatically. "Because we shouldn't have to prove ourselves to our own daughter. Questioning us like this? It's paranoid and ungrateful." Ungrateful. Another classic. "And selfish," my father added. "After everything we've done for you." I could feel myself shrinking inside, that old reflex of folding into myself when they raised their voices. But I forced myself to stand straighter. "I'm not refusing to help," I said quietly. "I just need basic information." "Anyone would." My mother scoffed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. The damage is your fault anyway. If you hadn't built the roof wrong, we wouldn't be in this mess." That hit me harder than I expected. "I was 16, I reminded them, "and I only did it because you told me we couldn't afford a contractor." My father's eyes narrowed. "Excuses. You always have excuses." I don't know what they expected. An apology for being a child? For not being a professional roofer at 16? Something in me bruised at the memory of those blistering summer days, hammering shingles into place while they lounged in lawn chairs. But I remained calm, refusing to feed their theatrics. As they kept talking, though, I began to notice their story shifting. First, they said the roof was leaking in multiple rooms. Then, moments later, it was only over the kitchen, but spreading fast. They claimed the contractor demanded immediate payment, but then admitted they hadn't actually called one. Every detail contradicted the last. It was like watching a poorly rehearsed play. My suspicion deepened with every sentence. After an hour of circular accusations and emotional landmines, they finally stormed outside to make a call, slamming the door behind them. I exhaled shakily and walked to my mailbox just to breathe fresh air. That's when my neighbor, Mr. Rowland, approached me. He's lived 2 doors down for years, a quiet man who rarely involves himself in anyone's business. He hesitated before speaking. "I'm not sure if I should tell you this," he said, "but your parents were here earlier today." My stomach dropped. "Here? Why?" "Well," he continued gently, "they were talking to a few neighbors. I happened to overhear." He paused, choosing his words with care. "They told people you refused to help your dying parents. They said you've turned your back on them." I stared at him, stunned. "Dying? They're not dying." He gave me a sympathetic look. I didn't think so, but that's what they said. The world tilted. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Anger, disbelief, humiliation. They weren't just manipulating me privately anymore. They were poisoning my reputation, playing the victims in a neighborhood they didn't even live in. It was calculated, strategic, cruel. "Thank you for telling me," I said quietly. My voice wavered despite my best efforts. He nodded. "You deserve to know." When I walked back inside, my parents were standing in my living room again, pretending nothing had happened. Their faces were masks of innocence, almost serene. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know what you told the neighbors," I said. "Why would you lie like that?" My mother didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head and delivered the coldest, most deliberate sentence she ever said to me. "You left us no choice, Lily. People need to understand what kind of daughter you really are." And then she added a new accusation, one so outrageous it made my knees weak. Lily learns her parents claimed she stole money from them years ago. For a moment, I couldn't fully process the accusation. The room felt like it shrank around me, the air suddenly too thick, too heavy. My mother's voice echoed sharply in my mind. "You stole money from us." I stared at her, stunned into stillness. "Stole?" I finally managed. "What are you talking about? I've never taken a cent from you." My father folded his arms as though preparing for a performance he'd rehearsed. "You stole from us by costing us years of support and financial planning," he announced, like he was delivering a verdict from some imaginary court. "When you refused to pursue the career we invested in, you robbed us." I blinked at him, confused. "The career you invested in? You mean when you pressured me to study nursing, even though I told you I didn't want that life? I paid for my own classes. I even worked 2 jobs to make it through school." My mother waved a dismissive hand. "Not good enough. We had expectations, Lily. We guided you. You chose to throw all that guidance away. That's stealing." My jaw tightened. "That's not how stealing works." "I don't care about your definitions," she snapped. "You took advantage. You wasted our years. And now you're refusing to help us when we need you most." I felt something inside me twist, not just anger, but a deep, familiar ache. A wound that had been reopened too many times to ever fully scar. They were rewriting history again, reshaping every memory to paint themselves as martyrs and me as the villain. This wasn't new. Not by a long shot. Growing up, they twisted everything in a way that always ended with them being right and me being indebted. If I wanted to join a club at school, they'd claim I was abandoning the family. If I wanted extra tutoring, they'd accuse me of draining their resources. Even when I got my first job at 14, my mother told me every paycheck belonged to them because they raised me. Every milestone became a debt. Every accomplishment became something they gave me. Every mistake became something I owed for. For years, I believed them, convinced that I was somehow fundamentally selfish, fundamentally disappointing. I had spent decades unpacking their voices from my head, trying to replace them with my own. And now, standing in my living room, I felt that old erosion creeping back in. But I fought it. "I didn't steal anything," I said again, this time with steadier resolve. "And you know it." They didn't like that answer. My father muttered something about ungrateful children ruining parents' lives. And my mother stormed toward the door, declaring she'd had enough of my attitude. But before she left, she turned back with a chilling smile. "You'll see, Lily, everyone will know what you've done." The door slammed, leaving a silence so sharp it felt like glass. I was still trying to gather myself when my phone buzzed. Seeing the name on the screen made my breath catch. Jenna, my childhood friend. We hadn't spoken in a while, but had kept a loose connection through occasional messages. I answered, still shaken. "Hey, Lily," she said gently. "Are you okay? Your parents came by my mom's house earlier. They were spreading some things." My hand gripped the phone tighter. "They told people I stole money from them." "I know," she said softly. "That's why I called." I sat down on the couch, bracing myself. "What else did they say?" "Before we get into that, do you remember when we were kids and you were saving money for college? Working at the diner, babysitting, doing everything you could?" A cold memory stirred. "Yes." "Well, I remember the day your mom bragged to my aunt that she convinced you to hand the money over because a good daughter doesn't question her parents." She laughed. I never forgot that. A hollow chill spread through me. "They told me it was to help the family." "I know," Jenna said. "But here's the thing. You also need to know they weren't as broke as they always said." My heartbeat quickened. "What do you mean?" "Do you remember when the roof leaked that summer? After you fixed it, they told everyone they didn't have insurance?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." "They lied," she said. "They had insurance. They got a payout. My mom remembers them bragging about it. They used the money for a trip, not repairs." The room tilted. What? They had money. Lily. They just didn't tell you. It felt like a large, heavy puzzle piece suddenly clicked into place, revealing the edge of something darker, bigger than manipulation, bigger than guilt. I swallowed hard. Jenna, why are you telling me all this now? There was a long pause, and then she said the sentence that changed everything. Lily, there's something else you need to know. Lily begins investigating the alleged roof issue and her parents' finances. I hardly slept after talking to Jenna. Every time I closed my eyes, the memories surfaced. My parents insisting they were struggling, insisting I step up, insisting every resource somehow belonged to them. But Jenna's words had cracked something open, something I couldn't ignore. If they lied about the insurance money, what else had they lied about? By morning, I'd made up my mind. I needed answers. Real answers. Not the ones they manufactured whenever it suited their narrative. So I drove out to my childhood neighborhood, a place I hadn't visited in years. The houses looked smaller than I remembered, the trees taller, the street quieter. But the old ache in my chest returned immediately, as if the ground itself carried memories I'd buried long ago. I started with Mrs. Donovan, the neighbor who used to give out giant chocolate chip cookies on Halloween. She recognized me instantly, pulling me into a warm hug that felt like a balm on my nerves. Your parents stopped by here the other day, she said, frowning. They were telling people you refused to help them. Frankly, it didn't sit right with me. I exhaled shakily. There's more to it than they're telling people. Oh, I'm sure, she said knowingly. Then, lowering her voice, she added, they've always had a way of twisting a story. You're not the first person they've tried to guilt. I blinked. What do you mean? She hesitated, then shrugged. Years back, they borrowed money from the Petersons and never paid it back. Claimed the Petersons gifted it to them out of gratitude. They told me the same thing about your college savings once. Said you gladly handed it over. My stomach curled. More twisting, more rewriting. Before leaving, I asked about the roof repairs from that summer. Mrs. Donovan frowned thoughtfully. Oh, they got insurance for that. I remember your mom bragging about the payout. She said it was good timing because they needed a vacation. I always wondered who actually fixed the roof. My pulse thudded in my ears. I thanked her and continued down the street, collecting more fragments of truth from neighbors who had witnessed far more than I realized. By noon, I pieced together a disturbing pattern. My parents had a history of manipulating anyone they could, always with dramatic stories about hardship. That alone was painful. But I needed concrete proof, so I drove to the county offices and requested public records on the property. It took time I sat in a stiff chair sorting through my emotions, but eventually the clerk handed over a file, and there it was. Official documentation showing the house had undergone roof repairs only 5 years ago. Not 30, not 20, 5. The repairs hadn't been minor either. They were extensive, complete, and fully paid for by insurance. My hands trembled as I compared the dates. Nothing matched my parents' claims. Nothing aligned with the emergency they insisted I had caused decades earlier. Their story didn't just have holes, it was obliterated. The only conclusion left was the one I didn't want to believe. The $12,000 wasn't for the roof at all. I called Jenna from the parking lot. You were right, I said, my voice hollow. They already fixed the roof. The insurance covered everything. I knew something was off, she replied. They've always used guilt to squeeze what they want. Then what is the money for? I asked. We might be able to find out, she said. Public tax records sometimes show liens, loans, court filings, anything that might point to financial trouble. It felt surreal, digging into my own parents' finances like an investigator, but I pushed the guilt aside. They had forced this. They had created this situation, and I deserved the truth. At my kitchen table, with notebooks and files spread across every inch, Jenna and I sifted through property records, tax statements, and archived filings. Most of it looked normal, almost too normal. But then Jenna paused. Look at this, she said, tapping a document. Your mother has a separate bank account listed here, one that wasn't mentioned in their joint filings. I frowned. A separate account? Why wouldn't they list it? Jenna clicked through the linked documents. Because it's under her maiden name. That's why it didn't show up with the others. My heart dropped. Is that Legal? It's not illegal to have a separate account, she said carefully. But hiding it while claiming to be broke? That's something else. We dug deeper, tracking the bank's identifying numbers through interconnected public financial disclosures. The further we went, the more my hands began to shake. Finally, the screen lit up with the balance. I inhaled sharply. It wasn't a small account. It wasn't a savings cushion. It was a large sum, far more than what they were demanding from me. But the strangest part wasn't the balance. It was the withdrawal history. Dozens of transactions, frequent, unexplained, money disappearing faster than it appeared. I stared at the pattern, feeling something icy crawl down my spine. Those withdrawals pointed to something intentional, something big, and I suddenly realized my parents might be hiding far more than lies. Lily brings documentation to confront her parents. I didn't rush into the confrontation. I wanted to walk in clear-headed, not as the teenage girl they used to bulldoze, but as the 58-year-old woman who finally understood the way they operated. I gathered every document I had printed, every public record, every insurance notation, every date that didn't align with their story. I rehearsed what I needed to say, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew they would try to twist every word. When I knocked on their door, the house looked the same as it always had, neat, polished, and deceptively calm. My mother opened it with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "Well," she said, stepping aside, "you finally came to your senses." "I came to talk," I replied, stepping in. My father was already in the living room, arms crossed, posture rigid. "What now?" he muttered. "Another excuse?" I sat at the dining table and laid the stack of documents down. "I want to go through this together." My mother's eyes narrowed when she saw the paperwork. My father sighed in irritation, as if I had brought them an inconvenience rather than the truth. "I found the records for the house," I said evenly. "The roof was repaired 5 years ago. Completely. The insurance covered every expense. There's no contractor, no new leak, no emergency." For a brief flicker of a moment, half a second, I saw surprise flash across my mother's face, but then her expression hardened. "That's nonsense," she snapped. "We don't know what you're talking about." I slid the papers toward her. "It's all here. Dates, invoices, records, public documents." My father shoved them back toward me. "You're delusional. You've always twisted things in your head. You never remember anything correctly." I felt a familiar pang because that was one of their oldest tactics. Undermine reality, question memory, make me doubt what I knew. But not today. "Nothing is twisted," I said calmly. "These are official records, and I deserve an explanation." My mother pressed a hand to her forehead dramatically. "You're attacking us. After everything we did for you, you come here with accusations. You've never loved us, Lily. Never. A loving daughter wouldn't demand paperwork and interrogate her own parents." There it was. The pivot to emotional manipulation. So predictable it should have come with a script. "I'm not interrogating you," I said. "I'm asking for honesty." "Oh, please," my father barked. "Honesty? You're determined to ruin us." I breathed slowly, grounding myself. Their rage wasn't about the roof. It was about losing control. "And when," my mother snapped, "did you become such an expert on our finances? You don't know anything about our account under my—" She froze. I froze. Jenna's words echoed instantly. "Your mother has a separate account under her maiden name." My mother's lips parted slightly, as if she could pull the words back into her throat. But it was too late. I leaned forward. "Your account under your maiden name, you mean?" Her face drained of color. My father's head whipped toward her, his eyes sharp with accusation. "You told her?" he hissed. "I didn't," she sputtered. She tricked me. This is her fault." "Really?" I said quietly. "Because the public records say otherwise. There's a separate account, with tens of thousands inside." My father slammed his fist on the table, making the papers jump. "You've been digging into our private business? Are you trying to destroy us?" "I'm trying to understand why you need $12,000 for a roof that doesn't need repairs," I said, forcing my voice to stay level. "And why you're hiding money while pretending to be broke." They both fell silent. Their eyes darted to each other, searching for a script, a lie, something they could use. But nothing came quickly enough. Finally, my father growled, "Fine. You want the truth? The money isn't for the roof." My mother's chin lifted defiantly. "We want to take a vacation. A real one. We deserve it after everything we've endured. And we need extra money for some retirement treats, things we've earned. A vacation, I repeated. Retirement treats. Yes, my mother snapped, and you're going to help us. It's the least you can do. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. So you lied, I said. You lied to the neighbors. You lied about being broke. You lied about the roof. And you expected me to hand over $12,000 anyway. Watch your tone, my father said, pointing a finger at me. No, I replied. I'm done watching my tone. They stared at me as if I had committed some unthinkable betrayal, not because I confronted them, but because I refused to fall in line. My mother stepped forward, her voice sharp and icy. If you don't give us the money, she said, you are dead to us. Completely. Do you understand? My father nodded, sealing the ultimatum. And in that moment, I realized their threat wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of how far they were willing to go. Lily finally accepts the full extent of their manipulation. When I left my parents' house after that confrontation, the cold air outside hit me like a shock to the system. I sat in my car with my hands gripping the steering wheel, staring ahead at nothing. My parents' words echoed in my ears, dead to us, and for the first time in my life, the sentence didn't paralyze me with fear. Instead, it settled in my chest like confirmation of something I had been tiptoeing around for years. They had never loved me unconditionally. They loved what I could give them. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and let myself breathe. Really breathe. Memories came flooding back. Not just events, but patterns, stories woven through my entire childhood. I remembered being scolded for crying when I was hurt, because tears make us look like bad parents. I remembered how every birthday gift came with a lecture about how expensive raising me was. I remembered how every ambition I had was measured against their needs, their expectations, their image. I had spent decades believing the narrative they fed me, that I was selfish, difficult, ungrateful. But now, seeing the full picture laid bare, I realized how deeply their words had shaped my entire self-concept. They had chiseled away at my confidence with precision, carving a version of me that they could control. And I had let them. But not anymore. On the drive home, something inside me crystallized, an acceptance so clear, so sharp, it almost hurt. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a resource, a tool, a backup plan. And now that I had drawn boundaries, they were punishing me for daring to exist outside their control. When I got home, I locked my front door, then walked through the house, making sure every window was secured. It wasn't fear driving me, it was closure. I blocked their phone numbers, their email addresses, even their social media accounts. I blocked them from my security cameras and updated my home access systems. The symbolic weight of those actions was heavier than anything I had ever done. For the first time in my life, I wasn't protecting them from my boundaries. I was protecting myself. I knew they wouldn't let it go easily, but I wasn't prepared for how fast their escalation came. It started with a message from my cousin Margaret. Lily, what is going on? Your parents told everyone you abandoned them with medical issues. Then another, from an uncle I barely spoke to. You're being cruel. They're old and suffering. How can you do this to them? Then 3 more. Then 5. Then a dozen. My parents had gone nuclear. They painted me as a monster, framing their lies as tragedy and my boundaries as betrayal. They told relatives they were sick, broke, near homelessness. They told people I was refusing to help 2 dying parents. They spun an entire story where they were victims, and I was the heartless daughter who turned her back. The old me, the version they had molded, would have spiraled into guilt, rushing to apologize for things I hadn't done. But the new me, the one who had finally seen behind the curtain, she didn't waver. I responded to each message the same way, calmly, factually, without emotion. I sent them the documentation, proof of the 5-year-old repairs, insurance payout dates, photos of the public records, screenshots of the financial documents showing the hidden account, every contradiction laid bare. There was no anger in my responses, just truth. The shift was immediate. Within an hour, several relatives apologized. Some were shocked, some embarrassed. A few admitted they'd always had suspicions about my parents' stories. Others shared they had been manipulated by them in the past. My Aunt Marjorie wrote, "I'm so sorry, Lily. I didn't know. I should have asked questions instead of assuming the worst." One by one, the messages changed tone, from accusation to sympathy, from anger to understanding. The facade my parents built was crumbling, and for the first time, other people were seeing what I had lived through. But I knew my parents. I knew they wouldn't stay silent long. By evening, when I finally sat down with a cup of tea, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but the preview text told me everything. "Lily, it's us. You need to read this." My heart tightened, not with fear, but with the weight of inevitability. They couldn't stand being ignored, couldn't stand losing control. Whatever this message contained, it wasn't going to be an apology. It would be a last-ditch effort, a desperate attempt to pull me back into the chaos. I opened the message. It started with, "You don't understand how much danger we're in." And as I kept reading, I realized this wasn't just another guilt trip. This was something else entirely, something they never expected me to uncover. Lily sees the final message. They threaten legal action. The message from my parents was longer than anything they'd sent in years. It started with theatrics, dramatic lines about danger, threats from unnamed forces, and how I was their only hope. But halfway down the text, the real motive emerged with sharp clarity. "If you continue refusing to help us, we will have no choice but to pursue legal action." I stared at the screen, not even shocked, just tired. They were weaponizing fear again, the same way they weaponized guilt and obligation. But this time, I didn't feel my stomach drop or my shoulders curl inward. Instead, I let out a slow breath and whispered the words I never imagined I'd say. "They don't control me anymore." I reread the message, line by line, analyzing it with the calm of someone who has finally stepped out of the fog. The phrasing was vague. No specific claims. No actual legal terminology. Just empty threats dressed in melodrama. Still, empty threats can grow teeth if left unaddressed, and I wasn't going to give them another doorway into my life. The next morning, I scheduled an appointment with a legal advisor. Sitting in the quiet lobby, I felt a strange mix of dread and relief. Dread that I was even in this position. Relief that I was finally doing something to protect myself. When I met with the advisor, a kind, patient woman named Elise, I handed her every document I had. The roof records, the insurance payouts, the financial inconsistencies, even a screenshot of the text message. She studied everything carefully, flipping through each page with an expression that shifted from curiosity to something closer to disbelief. Finally, she looked up at me. "Lily," she said, eyebrows raised, "you don't owe your parents a single cent. Not legally, not morally. And this," she tapped the threat message, "is not a legitimate basis for legal action. They have no grounds." A weight I didn't even realize I was carrying slid off my chest. She continued, "If anything, you would have legal standing against them for harassment or for spreading false statements. But as far as their threats, they're empty. Completely empty." I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the reassurance sink deep into my bones. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt fortified, firm, safe in the clarity of truth. When I left Elisa's office, sunlight warmed my face in a way that felt symbolic. I wasn't living under their shadow anymore. Over the next few days, word about my parents' behavior spread further through the community, partly because of their own attempts to turn people against me, partly because relatives I had shared evidence with were now sharing truths of their own. And then something unexpected happened. People started reaching out. Neighbors, extended relatives, even old acquaintances from my childhood who had once kept their distance. They told me stories I never knew. How my parents had borrowed money and never repaid it, how they'd guilted people into helping with repairs or errands, how they exaggerated hardships to get sympathy. Story after story, each one aligning with a pattern I had lived but never fully understood. It was as if a curtain had finally been pulled back, revealing a mosaic of manipulation that stretched far beyond just me. Their reputation, carefully constructed over years, was beginning to crack. My parents doubled down, of course. More guilt-laced messages came from unknown numbers. They accused me of turning the family against them. They claimed they were suffering because of my cruelty. They said the world would judge me harshly, but I held the line. I didn't respond. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself beyond the facts I had already shared. Silence, I discovered, was one of the strongest boundaries of all. And yet, amid the chaos, an unexpected ally emerged. My Aunt Caroline, a woman I'd always known to be gentle but distant, called me one evening. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Lily, dear, I heard what happened. I'm so sorry you're going through this. Your parents have caused more damage than you know." I swallowed. "I'm learning that." Caroline inhaled deeply, as though steadying herself. "There's something you need to understand, something your parents never wanted you to know." I held the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "They've been lying to the family for years," she said, "about their finances, about their debts, about their savings." She paused. "But there's one lie that overshadows all the others." A chill ran through me. "What lie?" There was a long moment of silence. Then Caroline said quietly, "Lily, your parents have far more money than they've ever admitted, and the reason they hid it has everything to do with you." Her voice trembled as she added, "I think you're finally ready to hear the whole truth." The aunt tells Lily about the money her parents have been hiding for decades. Aunt Caroline's voice was trembling, and that alone told me this wasn't going to be some minor revelation. She was usually composed, even soft-spoken, but now her words felt like they were fighting their way out. "Lily," she began, "your parents have been hiding money for a very long time. Decades." I felt my breath catch. "How long are we talking?" "Since you were a teenager," she said. "They received an inheritance from your grandfather, a large one. Enough to pay off their house, their debts, and still have plenty left over. But they didn't want anyone to know. Not the family, and especially not you." I stared at the wall, stunned. "They told me they were broke. Constantly." "I know," she replied. "That was part of the strategy. They used that narrative to control you. If you believed they were struggling, you'd feel obligated to help. You'd feel guilty for wanting independence." I closed my eyes as pieces I never knew existed slid into place. "They took my college savings while sitting on inherited money." "Yes," she whispered. "They used it as leverage. They always said you owed them because it kept you tethered. If you felt indebted, you wouldn't question them. You wouldn't leave." I felt that truth settle inside me, not like a wound, but like clarity. Like someone had finally switched on a light in a room I'd been stumbling through for half a lifetime. "And every guilt tactic," Caroline continued, "every accusation, every story they twisted, it was all part of the same pattern. Control, manipulation, dominance, not love." I swallowed hard. "So all those years, I wasn't the problem." "You were never the problem," she said with a certainty that pierced straight through me. The silence on the line stretched, heavy, but strangely liberating. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine that I hadn't been flawed or failing all those years. I had simply been targeted by two people who valued power far more than they valued me. Caroline sighed. "They've already called me, you know, begging for support. But once I heard the full story from your cousins and saw the evidence, I confronted them myself." "How did they react?" I asked, though I could already guess. "They panicked, then they deflected, then they blamed you." A humorless laugh escaped her. "They said you were trying to ruin the family, and when that didn't work, they started begging." That sounded familiar. Later that week, the begging reached me as well. After the extended family stopped siding with them, after their lies were exposed and their narrative collapsed, my parents suddenly became helpless, remorseful, fragile. At least that's the image they tried to project. One morning, I woke to a new message from an unknown number. "Lily, please. We need you. You're tearing this family apart. You're our only child. Help us make things right. Make things right." I stared at those words for a long time. The younger version of me, the one who lived off scraps of approval, would have rushed to them, would have apologized, would have felt responsible for their choices. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I saw the manipulation clearly now, like fingerprints on glass. The desperation wasn't about reconciliation. It was about losing control, losing their audience, losing their supply of sympathy and leverage. They weren't reaching out to heal. They were reaching out to pull me back under, and I refused to let them. That afternoon, I sat at my dining table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper. I didn't want to send them another text. I wanted my boundaries written, clear, deliberate, final, something they couldn't twist or reinterpret. I began the letter slowly, carefully. Mom, Dad, I am choosing to step away from the dynamic we've had my entire life. I will no longer participate in manipulation, guilt, or false narratives. I do not owe you money. I do not owe you continued access to my life. I owe myself peace, safety, and truth. This is not about punishment. This is about protection. Protection I should have given myself long ago. The words flowed easier than I expected. By the end, I wasn't shaking with fear or guilt. I was steady, centered, free. I sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it, and placed it by the door. Sending it felt like closing a door behind me, a door that had been held open by obligation and fear for far too long. As I stood there holding the letter, ready to drop it in the mailbox, a flutter of anxiety stirred in my chest. Not regret, just the gravity of what this meant. This was the line in the sand. The moment my life would change in a way I couldn't undo. I took a deep breath. And as I walked toward the mailbox, I braced myself, not for their retaliation, but for their reaction to the truth they had spent years trying to bury. Lily sends the letter that will change everything. I mailed the letter early the next morning. The sun had barely risen, and the world felt quiet, soft even, like it was holding its breath with me. As I slid the envelope into the mailbox, I felt a tremor in my hands. Not fear exactly, but the weight of a lifetime settling into its final shape. I watched the mail carrier take it later that afternoon, and with that simple exchange, the letter left my hands and entered theirs. It was done. I had said everything with clarity, honesty, and compassion. No accusations, no rage, no theatrics. Just boundaries, firm, long overdue, and it didn't take long for the response. 2 days later, I woke to a series of messages from unknown numbers, each one dripping with outrage. My parents' fury was familiar, but now it felt distant, like echoes from another lifetime. They accused me of betrayal, of abandonment, of destroying the family with lies and cruelty. They demanded I retract my letter. They demanded I apologize. They demanded money. But I didn't respond. Their anger was predictable. Their silence, however, came as a surprise. After 24 hours of tirades, everything went quiet, completely quiet. No calls, no texts, not even passive-aggressive attempts through relatives. It was as if they had vanished from my world entirely. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. The silence felt eerie, unnatural, as if waiting for a second wave. But as the hours passed, something inside me began to settle. The stillness became comforting, a space where I could finally breathe without bracing for impact. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to acknowledge the truth without softening it to protect them. Letting go of my parents wasn't an act of cruelty, it was an act of survival. I spent the next few days processing everything. Years of emotional manipulation, the lies, the shifting narratives, the threats, the control. I sat with the grief of what could have been and the relief of what would no longer be. I cried, not because I regretted my decision, but because I was releasing decades of weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. In those moments, a profound realization settled into my bones. I do not owe them my life. I never did. What I owed myself, however, was something I had been withholding for years. Gentleness, freedom, protection, truth. Slowly, I began rebuilding. I reached out to the family members who had supported me. My cousin Margaret invited me over for dinner. My Aunt Caroline called regularly, checking in with genuine concern. Conversations that once felt heavy now felt warm, grounding. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to carry everything alone. I also turned my attention inward, toward the parts of myself that had been neglected, dismissed, or silenced. I found a therapist who specialized in emotional abuse and family trauma. Walking into that office for the first time felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of drifting. I told her everything, every manipulation, every guilt tactic, every moment I had doubted myself. She listened without judgment, offering validation I never received growing up. Week by week, I learned to unravel the narratives my parents had woven around me. I learned to replace their voices with my own. I learned that boundaries are not walls, they are doors. Doors I can choose to close, lock, or reopen based on safety, not fear. And as I healed, something remarkable happened. My relationships with others began to shift. I found myself forming healthier boundaries. I stopped over-explaining. I stopped apologizing for existing. I stopped sacrificing my peace to keep others comfortable. My life, for the first time, felt like it belonged to me. One afternoon soon after, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the wind move through the trees. The sky was a soft blue, the kind that feels like a quiet promise. And as I listened to the leaves rustle, I realized something deeper than all the revelations before it. This was the first time I had ever felt truly free. No guilt, no fear, no obligations disguised as love. Just me, Lily, standing in the life I had built, not the one I had been forced into. I thought back to the letter I sent, the final boundary I had drawn, and the journey that had brought me here. And with a steady exhale, I spoke the words aloud, as if sealing them into the air. I finally understand what I owe myself. And for the first time in my life, what I owed myself, peace, truth, and freedom, was exactly what I intended to keep. In the end, walking away from my parents wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of survival. I finally chose peace over chaos, truth over manipulation, and myself over the version of me they tried to shape. My life is quieter now, but it's mine, and that makes every step worth it. And if there's one thing I learned, it's this. Letting go doesn't mean you stopped caring. It means you finally started caring about yourself. So tell me, if you were in my place, would you choose your family's approval or your own freedom? If this story resonated with you or reminded you of someone finding their voice after years of being silenced, feel free to stay connected. Stories like this matter because they show we're not alone in the battles we don't talk about. If you'd like to hear more real journeys of strength, healing, and standing up for yourself, you know where to find me.